尊敬的劳汉斯图比亚娜大使，尊敬的谢振华主任，尊敬的何建空校长，各位来宾、老师们、同学们、校友们，大家下午好！欢迎大家再次来到气候变化大讲堂。不知不觉呢，我们的大讲堂已经举办的这是第70期，所以可敬可贺，所以我向大家再鼓鼓掌。在今天这个重要的日子，全球气候治理领域的重量级嘉宾，大讲堂的老朋友、好朋友，推动巴黎协定达成、通过、签署生效的原法国气候大使和 COP21 特别代表，现任欧洲气候基金会首席执行官，巴黎政治大学气候学院院长，清华大学荣誉教授劳汉斯图比亚娜女士再次来到大讲堂，让我们以热烈的掌声欢迎她的到来。同时呢，气候变化大讲堂的创始者，中国气候变化事务原特使，我们敬爱的谢振华学长也来到了现场，让我们以热烈掌声表示欢迎。去年，图比亚娜教授呢，曾在大讲堂以巴黎协定10周年以及全球气候治理为主题发表演讲，系统回顾了巴黎协定10年以来对全球气候治理规则的重塑作用，也深入分析了全球气候治理面临的现实挑战，帮助我们从多边治理的角度，更清晰地理解了全球气候行动所处的关键节点。他长期深度参与国际气候治理进程，对多边合作、能源转型以及全球治理秩序演变有着极为丰富的实践经验和深刻的洞察。今天呢，他将以电力时代的能源权利，构建更具韧性与安全的能源秩序为题，与我们分享他的观察与思考。之前呢，我有幸看了一下他的讲稿，我觉得内容非常的丰富，而且非常深入。所以下边呢，让我们以热烈的掌声欢迎图比亚娜教授进行演讲。
It's here. Okay.
How about too small, maybe?
Yeah, it's right. Yeah, I will not use it. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I'm very honored, very privileged to be here again. I think since I came here and had been really deeply honored by this position as an honorary professor. The situation has been more complex than we discussed even some months ago. What is really, of course, and that warms the spirit when you come to China, again from a continent that, of course, has its own difficulties. It's really exciting to see this global transformation happening in this country with such vision, such long-term vision. And so anyway, whatever happened, whatever the circumstances, we see that there is a drive, a vision that is really good to recognize in China that can help us look forward and not only on the actual crisis. But of course, I need today to address directly the major events playing out right now. The crisis in Iran and the Gulf is still going. It's impossible to see how it will be developed. And it's, above all, a terrible, terrible human tragedy, both from Iran, inside, outside the Gulf countries, including the crisis in Gaza that is going on. But it is a major shock to the global energy system. I think IEA describes that as the largest in modern history, and one to which every country is exposed. And even if the Strait of Hormuz is fully reopened, the significant damage to Gulf and oil gas infrastructure means supply will take a long time to fully disappear. And the lagged effect on many sectors of the shock will continue to be felt for some time. That now the second fuel shock of this magnitude, but even bigger than in less than 5 years. So it's really short-term volatility and of course, a shock to the whole system. Now it's becoming very clear that governments, corporate, and people around the world feel that fossil fuel-based energy is inherently vulnerable to this kind of disruption. And so, let me clear from the outset, I strongly believe the emerging renewable-based electric order is a better system, and we have only to accelerate the deployment. It's more stable, more resilient, more desirable in many elements. But we should not be complacent in thinking that the transition will be automatic, just because the economics, arguments, and narrative are increasingly on our side. Not. It's not happening, really. So for many reasons, because the fossil fuel order have been built over more than 2 centuries, deeply embedded in the political and economic structure of most states, in our trade and financial systems, that create inertia and strong incentive to resist rapid change. We should recognize also that the electric order that we can now see the outline of will bring its own challenges, which I will address in this lecture. If the transition is to lead to a more stable and resilient global energy system, which I think we can, these challenges need to be understood and addressed. That require a clear-eyed, intellectually and honest way of thinking about how energy systems organize political power. That's why the distinction between petrostate and electrostate, the topic of my lecture, is a useful starting point. It's, of course, a very simplified lens, but it helps to frame a central question: how political power is structured in the energy system we have today, and how it will be in the system we are trying to build for tomorrow. Why most countries want to be out of this fossil fuel order? Well, practically every country today is a fossil fuel dependent system importing, and but some countries are not. So the ones who are producers, but mostly 3/4 of these countries are net importers of fossil fuel today. They rely on oil and gas for the production of electricity, transport, industry, heating, but more importantly, what they consume, including the petrochemical outcomes. This leaves them greatly exposed to the kind of supply shock we are currently seeing, and food sector is a big one. This shock are experienced through some combination of higher cost rationing, which happened already in some countries in Asia, and demand destruction, with the burden falling to various degrees of household, firms, and the state, and normally is not really a fair distribution of the cost. In developed economies, this is painful and economic and politically destabilizing, but usually surmountable. In developing economies, it can easily become a full macroeconomic crisis, in particular in less developed countries. Until recently, countries had few alternatives in the face of such shock. They could try to diversify suppliers or reduce demand at the margin. But the underlying dependence on fossil fuel imports was inescapable. And with the rapid emergence of clean technologies, that constraint is now weakening. The cost of clean technology, you know that, continues to fall sharply. Even between 2022 and 2025, the price of solar panels declined by close to 70%, driven largely by manufacturing, of course, in China. Solar now requires less upfront capital than fossil power. A decade ago, it will require 5 times more. Solar plus battery is expected to reach that same level before 2035. So increasingly, the fossil fuel, not clean technology, that carries the burden of capital intensity. So that's a big element for the distribution globally of the clean energy. Today, countries and their citizens have options that they were not available even during the 2022 and 23 gas crisis. They have now a viable pathway to reduce their structural dependence on imported fuel. But in practice, that pathway requires 2 distinct shifts. which should not always move together. First, electrifying end uses as demand for import fuels falls to replacing oil and gas in transport, heating, and part of industry with electricity through technologies such as electric vehicle, heat pumps, hydrogen, electrified industrial processes. Second, pushing fossil fuel out of electricity generation so that power prices are no longer tied to global commodity markets. Countries are advancing along these two dimensions in very different speeds. In Pakistan, solar adoption has accelerated very, very quickly. 2024 alone, Pakistan imported around 22 gigawatts of solar panels. This is expected to reduce the fossil fuel import by about 57 billion, roughly a third of Pakistan's real annual energy import bill. What is striking is the speed and the fact that this shift has been driven largely by independent households and businesses. In Nigeria, the contrary, solar and battery mini-grid are being set up to serve communities that lack reliable access to electricity. And to my interest and surprise at COP30, I saw Nigeria really wanting to diversify its economy and going for more electrification than to be still heavily dependent on the fossil fuel export. So this system can provide more reliable power than the central grid and at lower cost than diesel generation for a country like Nigeria. But there is also a side of the transition electrifying end uses, which is more difficult. Requires change to vehicle fleets, of course going very fast in China, industrial process, still of course the most difficult part, and household equipment. These often involve higher upfront costs and less mature technologies. But there are promising signs of change. Just think about Ethiopia. Electrification of transport is being pursued as a strategy to reduce fossil fuel imports and ease chronic pressure on the balance of payment. Just in 2024, as you may know, Ethiopian government has banned the import of IC engines and even have risen from less than 1% to around 6% of the total fleet in just 2 years. But of course, there are real challenges, charging infrastructure, and in Ethiopia, that is limited access to electricity even, which is still very uneven across the country. So, but it opened new possibilities. Electrification opened new possibilities, even in a country that has lacked and was really affected by transport poverty. Of course, China, no need to say, it's making impressive advance on all these fronts. On the generation side, wind, solar, and hydro now supply around 40% of electricity. Energy already accounts for close to 30% of final energy use and continue to rise. This is a way we can say that now China is more and more looking as being an electrostate and of course reducing its dependence on fossil fuel. Electricity is 39% of final energy demand in buildings. The electric vehicles account for around 50% of new car sales, and it's estimated that EV adoption displaced more oil demand in 2025 than China imported from Iraq, its third largest supplier. So the savings are immense and already there. And we know that China is a provider, a world provider on clean technology, both on electrification and clean power at home. In Europe, countries have managed to reduce the role of gas in power generation, are now much less exposed to price spikes, and are seeing the benefits of lower and more stable electricity prices. Spain is a clear example. I know that Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez came here in this university to explain what was the policy of its country. And that's true that the progress in Spain has been remarkable. Now only gas set electricity price just 15% of the time, compared to close 90% in Italy. And as a result, a clear price differential has emerged during the Iran crisis within the European countries. Gas-reliant markets such as Italy and Ireland are paying electricity price wholesale around 150 and 40 euros megawatt hour, while more renewable rich systems like Portugal and Spain as only paying on a wholesale price, and northern Sweden closer to 40 megawatt hour, 40 euros megawatt. This is enormous difference. It makes a whole difference in competitiveness, for example. This divergent experience is reinforcing the political commitment to renewable and electrification across Europe. You may have heard, and I saw some Chinese colleagues worried about the backtracking of climate policy in Europe. In reality, we have Haven laws. There are, of course, industry concerns. But at the same time, now again, like after 2022, there's a recommitment of going much faster on electrification and on clean energy. So the EU now, I saw France, even now setting a new national electrification plan, and the EU Commission will present this new electrification strategy very soon. And why Europe has overcome a central challenge, because as long and has to do that, as electricity prices remain tied to fossil fuel, and therefore high and volatile, the electrification of end uses will be held back. So this is not the hurdle, the node that we have to break to get really the benefit for the consumer of the cheap price of electricity. Therefore, so will Europe's ability to insulate itself from fossil shock. And that begins now to be a more and more in a way, dominant feature of the discussion. And you know, even in election recently in Hungary, for example, we saw that people wanted a more European policy, a more clean policy than the one tied to the consumption of Russian gas. Why the fossil fuel order persists then? So it's tempting to assume that the transition is a done deal, a technological and economic inevitability. On the very long term, it is. But on the midterm, there is questions. Because the fossil fuel system has been built over more than centuries, as I said, deeply embedded in national economies, public finances, infrastructure system, and geopolitical relationships. In some countries, entire state structure, fiscal models, and political settlement depends on it. And that creates some incentive to resist rapid change, and particularly true in what we might call now, which is now a sort of a word that has been framed by a Financial Times journalist, a petrostate. It's loosely used for some countries, but what defines this petrostate is not production alone, but dependence on that production. I remember in COP30, President Lula calling for breaking not the oil and gas production in Brazil, but breaking the dependence of the state, of the oil and gas dependence. And in fact, in a petrostate, government really rely heavily on revenues for oil and gas rather than broad-based taxation. And you know that the social contract behind this relation that is really important to look at, because then the state has always to provide funding for all the services based on the revenues from oil and gas. And then the state's central function becomes the capture and distribution of these rents. And this poses a number of problems we have seen in the past, and many countries have been shaped by that context. That shapes incentive in a very direct way to maintain production and defend oil and gas demand, and therefore to slow as long as possible, the energy transition. Most petrostates recognize the vulnerability of their dependence on oil and gas export. They know that their long-term interests lie in diversifying their economies, and they are trying to do it. But fluctuating oil and gas price leaves them highly vulnerable to sudden budgetary savings and swings. So fiscal decisions are made under persistent uncertainty about future price. And due to the current crisis, all 6 Gulf states are expected to record negative GDP growth this year, before 5 to 10% decrease. And so we see countries like Saudi Arabia spending heavily on projects to diversify their income away from fossil fuel, while also investing heavily in renewable. That Saudi Arabia, for example, aims to generate 50% of its electricity from renewable by 2030, and primarily solar. But at the same time, and it can be understood, and as a climate diplomat, I've witnessed that, countries like are so dependent on fossil fuel try to delay the transition, but to use as long as possible these resources that they are dependent upon. And at the same time, as the transition becomes more credible, the danger feels stronger. The incentive for petrostates to double down on fossil fuel actually intensify. The more uncertain the future of demand, the stronger the incentive to extract and monetize reserves while markets still exist. That's why you have such a controversy between some scenario REA and some oil exporting countries on the future. So the result is a tendency, unfortunately, to double down on the very model that those countries ultimately need to move beyond. So the petrostates, as a definition, have consistently and very effectively worked to slow political and diplomatic progress on the transition, lobbying against phase-out language at COPs, promoting technologies that extend fossil use, such as CCS, which is really for the moment in a little bit in a limbo as a big investment. They have been smart in their outreach to the group of developing countries that are not petrostate, but whose economies do rely significantly on fossil fuel export. This distinction matters. These countries are not defending the fossil fuel order in the way petrostates do. In many cases, they recognize that reliance on fossil commodity export as a vulnerability, and they are seeking, to varying degrees, to move towards more diversified economic model. But they still face significant economic global constraints in doing so. Colombia is a very good example of that country, as such a country. The fossil fuel account for around half of its export and 3 to 6% of the GDP. By contrast, in many Gulf countries, oil and gas account for the majority of export and often, which is even more important, more than 50 to 70% of the government revenues. It relies on fossil fuel revenue for employment to help fund for public services. But unlike in a petrostate, the state is not structurally organized around the capture and distribution of fossil rents, in the case, for example, as Colombia. The rents are simply too small for fossil fuel to define the system in the same way. So for these countries, the politics of the transition are especially complex. There are significant domestic constituencies that want to reduce dependence on fossil fuel, but there are also legitimate development and fairness arguments about their right to use their own resources in a moment where the markets are flourishing. So they don't want to be the first to forego their reserves. And debt markets and credit rating agencies have reacted badly to past attempts to move away from fossil fuel production. This is why initiatives like the Santa Marta Conference on the transition away from fossil fuel matters. It addresses the real complex web of structural and distributional constraints that lock in fossil dependency. It's not simple to break away from that dependence. It breaks the perpetual chicken and egg dilemma between the demand and the supply side, at least it's aimed to do that, and deal with the additional risk and fairness concern of being a first mover, because that was the case for Colombia and some other countries before that. The conference in Santa Marta will see 45 countries get together to discuss these issues. After more than 85 countries came out in favor of developing roadmaps for transition away from fossil fuel at COP30 to try to put in place in implementation the language that was set in Dubai at COP28. And in a way, it's interesting that it is hosting Colombia because that embodies this contradiction, this tension, and in a way, it may be finding a way out. What do we talk about United States? Is this a petrostate in the classical sense? It should not be. It takes base broad, economy highly diversified. The political system is not organized around the distribution of fossil fuel rents, but it plays a big role in American politics, as we know, in particular in financing the campaign. Both domestically and in external posture, US is increasingly exhibiting some of the characteristics of a petrostate and is now acting as a central geopolitical anchor of the fossil fuel order. Following the shale revolution in the 2010s, the United States is now the world's largest combined producer of oil and gas and became a net exporter in 2019. And the US is producing now more fossil fuels than any country at any moment in history, a milestone reached under the Biden administration. This has altered profoundly the political of energy within the United States and its posture abroad. The role of oil and gas interest in US politics is not new. Firms such as ExxonMobil and Chevron have long had significant influence, particularly within the Republican Party. But what has changed is the scale and explicit of that alignment, primarily with the political right. The expansion of shale production has raised the economic stakes, and with it, the political centrality of this sector. And this is really new since the 2010s. This political system is increasingly organized around corporate interests. Unsurprisingly, that one of the most prominent industries is highly influential. As President Trump put it in his inaugural address, oil is liquid gold that will make the US a rich nation again. It's telling of the grip that fossil fuel interests now have on US politics, that exporter interests are being pursued even when they come at the expense of domestic consumers. As exports expand, domestic prices increasingly converge with higher international prices. The United States is now using the full range. I have never seen that of my 30 work years in climate, energy policy, and international diplomacy. It's now using really the full range of trade, diplomatic, and political pressure to sustain and expand global demand for fossil fuel, ideally its own. In recent trade negotiation, for example, the US demanded the EU increase the purchase of US LNG as a precondition for easing tariffs. And it's worth noting that there was an attempt to build an alternative political economy in US. The Inflation Reduction Act was designed to create a domestic constituency with a material stake in electrification and clean manufacturing. It allocated around $370 billion public funding to clean energy, manufacturing, and deployment. And the hope was this investment would generate their own political defenders, even within the Republican Party. But that coalition proved far too fragile in the face of an administration that is seeking to oppose renewable energy projects, even where they are not in direct competition with fossil fuel interests. The intensity of the current US position cannot be explained purely by a desire to expand oil and gas export. For part of the US political right, the energy transition is now positioned as a direct threat to American power. So in a way, that's why we can call, in my view, US as a petrostate. Their argument is essentially, why would the US move away from one of its most competitive sectors and the pillar of its energy security towards an energy system in which China holds a dominant technological and supply chain position? And why would it allow other countries to shift away from an energy system in which the US is a leading player towards one in which China holds that position? From this perspective, which totally ignore the reality of climate change anyhow and its impacts, the defense of fossil fuel became a defense of US hegemony and national security, as they said. Promoting fossil fuel export abroad and discourages the transition in other countries. And I have seen the pressure on many developing countries on that style to really curb that climate policy that describes as really bad policies that could create poverty and, in a way, a threat to US relation. So it's really not just about the commercial interest or domestic political alignment. It's preserving a model of the global political economy and power in which the United States want to retain its central role, even if we can consider that's probably too late already. To quote President Trump, the United States should become the dominant energy power in the world, which oil and gas as a primary means of achieving that. There is an irony here. The war in Iran looks likely to undermine that very strategy, But of course, the motivation behind US policy in the region are complex, cannot be reduced to energy alone. But in a way, now more and more frequently, President Trump analyzed that the fossil fuel system energy against the renewable one. So in a way, the war has done huge damage to trust among Gulf states, the core petrostate in the United States as a reliable power. And I can notice that EU now was in a way trying to find a compromise 1.5 years ago, with US has in a way dropped the ball entirely on that side. But it strengthens the case for most countries that continued reliance on the fossil fuel system is a source of vulnerability rather than security. And you know how much energy security is an important component of any country's stability. So why does the electric order not have stronger advocates in international forums? Well, first, the fossil fuel order has clear and active defenders. Again, since in the last 30 years I've been involved in this discussion, I've never saw such aggressivity of this sector. But what is less clear is why we don't yet see the mirror image emerging on the other side. Countries that are moving fastest on electrification and clean technology are not yet systematically pushing to accelerate the transition in the same way in international forum. And that's why, of course, that's not a mystery. I'm really hoping that China will take that role. That may reflect a mix of powers and factors, domestic priorities taking precedence, a preference to compete economically rather than lead politically, or simply the fact that the political economy on this new system is still taking shape. I see that in the clean sector in Europe very clearly. It's still not mature enough to have a voice, and of course, all the role we have at European Climate Foundation, and I will still, of course, be doing, is really to make this sector much more vocal, to call for that support for the government as well as the international positioning of the European Union. So what are the geopolitical order, as my last points, that could, in a way, favor the electrification? That significance of electrification is not only that it allows countries to reduce their exposure to fossil fuel, is that it changes relationship between geography, energy, and power. Discussing with a colleague, Emmanuel, which was reading a quote from Deng Xiaoping in 1992, saying US has oil and gas, but we have critical materials and we have technology very early on. So it's about geography as well. So oil and gas must be continuously extracted where they are found and transported over long distance, and that create enduring asymmetries between producers and importers. It embeds vulnerability into the structure of the system itself. An electrified system is organized differently. Energy is generated through infrastructure, solar, wind, grid, storage, that can be deployed in a much wider range of geographies. So more security, more independence in theory. Resource endowments still matter, but they are far more widely distributed than fossil fuel. An electrified system is more capital intensive and less dependent on continuous commodity flows. Once installed, clean energy infrastructure produces power without the need for ongoing imports of fuel. And of course, no serious account of an electric order suggests that it is without its own set of geopolitical risks. And we are facing them, of course, all these years. But the nature of those risks is very different, and in my view, in important respect, much more manageable. A common concern today is Europe and other Western countries is a concentration of clean technology supply chains. As we all know today, China legitimately occupies a dominant position across most of its system in manufacturing of solar panel, batteries, and other key components, and in the processing and refining of critical minerals. The concern about this concentration are understandable. Nobody likes this type of concentration. Concentrated supply chains are more vulnerable to disruption of various kinds, natural disaster, cyber risk, and trade dispute. And there is a risk of significant political backlash against clean tech imports if dependencies are seen as excessive. For example, in some European countries, opponents of the energy transition are trying to attack green policies by arguing they increase geopolitical dependence on China. But really, we should be clear that these risks are not comparable with fossil fuel dependence. China's current position is a result of a far-sighted, sustained, and coherent industrial strategy. This has delivered scale, cost reduction, and technological leadership. It's a major driver of the global transition, especially in developing countries. And unlike fossil fuel production, China clean tech leadership is not geologically determined. Of course, China will remain the dominant player in many areas of the clean tech for the foreseeable future. But as Paul Krugman argues, normally the agglomeration effect and technological leadership that is achieved will be difficult to replicate elsewhere. But other countries and regions can, over time, develop at least some of their own capacity and supply chain. If they choose to pursue the industrial strategy, investment and coordination required to build alternatives. Some degrees, we have seen already, of trade tension is probably inevitable, as countries try to build their own capacity and capture a greater share of the value chain. But it is in the interest of all sides that this tension do not escalate into fragmentation. I saw some remarks of the US administration today saying that critical materials should be imported by the allies. Well, now everybody asks who are these allies left, but they should pay and import from specific countries and not other countries. This putting geopolitics in a wrong sense. But we must recognize that critical minerals deserve particular attention because they could be the closest parallel to the extractive logic of fossil fuel, but with important difference. Fossil fuel must be continuously extracted, transported, and burned. In contrast, at least I hope so, critical minerals are inputs into long-lived assets, deployed upfront and replaced only gradually over time, rather than consumed continuously. And I must say, we know that we can recycle them really in a very high manner. And they are generally more widely distributed geographically. Along deposits vary significantly in scale and accessibility, that's true, but our understanding of global reserve remains very incomplete and is so recent. But there are real risks and challenges that need careful consideration. For the moment, the supply chains are currently highly concentrated. Extraction, and especially processing and refining, are dominated by a small number of actors. As the IEA has documented, export control and other supply restriction has been used more frequently in recent years. This has helped explain why diversification of supply has become a central strategic objective for many countries. And that is the same logic that has driven Chinese policy efforts to secure its own supply chains in many sectors in recent years. Second, there is a clear lesson for the fossil fuel era. Resource-rich countries do not want to be confined to exporting raw material, and it's good, of course, while value is captured elsewhere in the supply chain. There is a growing and a healthy expectation that they will participate more fully in processing, manufacturing, and value creation. And managing this risk and building a system that is balanced and fair to resource-rich countries and secure without becoming fragmented should be a shared objective of all countries. This is also a central task for international climate governance in this next phase of the transition. So how we should govern an international electric order in which power is shaped less by geology and more by industrial strategy, technology, and infrastructure? How do we create the condition for coordination and cooperation while managing the risk and tension that will inevitably arise? Because we should not forget that we have to accelerate and not just managing trade tension, because climate change is not obeying, and the law of physics are not obeying to the politics or the trade laws. So we need international multilateral framework capable of managing trade tension linked to clean industrial policy, not to eliminate competition, but to ensure it does not produce protectionist spirals and delay and that slows the transition and raises its cost. Ensuring that critical mineral development does not reproduce extractive patterns of the past and a sort of neo-colonialism on these resources, which in a way has terrible social consequences, as we witness this already in a number of countries. And supporting cooperation on the many practical challenges of implementation, from infrastructure planning to technology deployment. So getting the international governance right is really not an abstract question or a theoretical one. It will determine whether the transition proceeds at speed, scale, and cost required to limit climate disruption and build a more stable energy system. So governing the system internationally is only one very important part of the picture, and we don't know exactly how to do it, but really working at a fair and transparent system and diversified. But we know how it works at domestic level. And here too, in my view, electrified system has significant structural advantage over the fossil fuel system. But those advantages will not realize themselves automatically. And Pakistan provides a clear example of both the potential and the limits of the shift. The rapid solar adoption has allowed households and business to reduce their exposure to imported fuels and unreliable supply. For the first time, many have access to a more stable and predictable source of electricity. But the shift is very uneven, and we have seen that in many countries. I have even, for example, the example in Europe of Poland. Solar adoption has been disproportionately driven by more affluent households and businesses, and reducing their reliance on the grid that was already under strain. But the grid still carries very fixed costs, large costs. And so if the richer household or businesses don't contribute to the grid because they can be dependent of it, then you see the consequences. So higher paying users reduce their consumption of the grid supply electricity, and then the fixed costs are hopefully naturally spread across a smaller and poorer customer base. This creates potentially a very regressive dynamic. Those who can afford solar reduce their bills, which happened in Poland with the heating, while those who cannot afford solar face rising price and deteriorating service. So the issue is not decentralized generation or solar generation itself. It's done well, decentralized generation can give households and communities a stake in the energy system. So problems arise in the absence of the state capable of maintaining the system as a shared public good. But that requires rules, coordination, and investment, and in short, it requires a state. Electrification, if to be efficient and equitable, has to be managed as a system-wide public good. I speak about that in a country that really is building that common system at a national level, even if it's a big geographical diverse setting. And I do think this is a problem of EU as a whole if we look at the 27 countries. If we don't do that effectively, we will not realize the full benefit of the electrification. So one of the central tasks of international climate diplomacy should be to support countries, particularly developing economy, in building the state capacity to manage that. Because the promise of clean technology is enormous, but realizing that promise depends on countries having the tools to turn it in a functioning system. This challenge takes different forms in advanced economy, but the underlying dynamics are very similar. In Europe, electrification is being pursued at continental scale. From a system perspective, the logic is clear. Solar resources in the south, wind in the north, connected through expanded interconnected grids, plus the supply of nuclear electricity. But prices, as electricity flows across the borders, price differences narrow and are shaped by condition and neighboring system. So investment decision, choice about where to build generation and grid affect and are affected by neighboring countries. And that risk shocks, supply disruption, or system imbalance are transmitted more easily across interconnected networks. That's why there is such a strong discussion, a heated discussion in Europe about the full integration of the European grids. So integration will improve outcomes, lower price at cheaper generation can be shared across a wider system, more efficient investment as capacity is built where resources are strongest and cost lowest, more resilience as country can draw on a broader and more distributed pool of supply when shock occurs. But integration has distributional effects. Who bears the cost versus who captures the benefits? For example, and it's the case now between Sweden and Germany, consumers and taxpayers in one country may be asked to fund green expansion in their country, while the benefits, the lower prices or greater system stability are shared across the wider system. And electrification and renewable change the relative cost of energy between regions. This raises difficult questions about where economic activity, particularly energy-intensive industry and hydrogen production, should be located. There may be a strong economic case to locate industry where clean power is cheapest, but this implies shift in jobs, investment, and regional development that are really very politically difficult. Within the EU and other cross-border grid projects, these tensions are more pronounced because they touch on sensitive questions of sovereignty and the balance between national and collective interests. But they play out as well within countries. For example, in the UK, there are active debates about whether to maintain a single national electric price or move towards more localized pricing. This would create incentive to make more economy more sense, but would clearly produce regional winners and losers. So what about now the case for China, Europe, and cooperation? Renewable resources are concentrated in the north and the west, while demand is highest in the east for China. And China has demonstrated impressive state capacity in addressing these challenges, larger scale transmission investment, coordination of where capacity is built, and innovative grid system for matching supply and demand. But other countries may not exactly replicate China's approach, which reflects its specific circumstances and particular institutional and political characteristic. I'm thinking very strongly in the relation between Spain, Portugal, and France on that side, where France is, of course, very reluctant to absorb the clean electricity produced constantly by Spain and Portugal. But there is a lot we can learn from each other. There is deep expertise here in China, an institution like your university, like Tsinghua, and across Europe, in both public institutions and the private sector. I do think really we know we have and our own bilateral clean trade and investment relationship. Europe and China will need to find a sustainable arrangement and path. Europe is right to want to build its own clean tech sector as the backbone of the future economy, to manage its exposure, to concentrate supply chain, and address the risk of political backlash that could jeopardize the energy transition and therefore demand for Chinese clean technology. As I have said before, Europe resorting to high tariff would be a mistake. When the EU imposed high tariffs on Chinese solar panels in the mid-2010s, it effectively crippled its own solar installation sector by raising prices. And the smarter approach is to seek agreement that creates the condition for joint venture, investment, and technological cooperation. Certainly a reverse of the formal model of European companies investing in China with joint ventures, and now it's a moment, of course, to do in the other direction. The Industrial Accelerator Act proposed by the European Commission is not a perfect instrument and not even really finally detailed, but it reflects a sincere and serious attempt to strike the balance between strengthening domestic capacity and remaining open to competition and collaboration. Candidly, I must say it's a very sensitive issue in Europe today because there are political economy around that. It goes to the heart of jobs, regional economy, and the central role industry still plays in prosperity and identity in many parts of Europe. If the right balance is not found, there is real risk that attitude will harden and support for open trade in clean technology will weaken. That is not in Europe's interest, not at all. It's not in China's interest either, which is why it's so important at that particular moment that Europe and China demonstrate that they are able to work through this tension constructively. Together, they are central to the functioning, and I must say even the survival of the Paris Agreement and the broader system of multilateral climate cooperation. There is a huge amount to gain from deepening cooperation between Europe and China. So much we can achieve together. And really, this week is not the first time, but I've been struck by the talent, expertise, and openness I have seen here in Beijing. And in my frequent visit in the past, but even more now, I do think that in the Chinese circle, there is understanding that we have now this window of opportunity to collaborate with Europe in a world where, you know, the rule of the game are totally distorted, and some adults in the room are needed. And I hope that will be the case for Europe and China.
好，非常感谢图比亚娜教授的这个精彩的演讲。我刚才已经预告过了，他非常的综合，非常的系统，非常的深入。但是今天来讲呢，我们这个给他安排了很多的这个议程，所以下边来讲呢，这个我们在提问之前呢，先请谢振华主任呢给这个图比亚娜大使授牌，以纪念表彰他对我们大讲堂的贡献。这样一上来可能行。 There are more than 1,000 students on the online research. Thank you.谢谢。那个在这儿合影吗？你在这边，我们都坐回来在这儿上合影。可以看，实际上可以看到高手他们仰视
来掉，后班同学抬头看清楚了，我们在好，谢谢上面。
From the meeting, we have only 2 questions. No hurry, no hurry. Only 2 questions. You can sit down. I guess you are from France, the gentleman. You're from France. Please introduce yourself and then ask a question.
Okay.
In short.
Yes. Hello from my side. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. My name is Michael Spiekermann. I've been one of the spokesperson of Fridays for Future, which for the context here is the world's largest youth-led climate protest movement, and also youth delegate for COP26 and 7 for my country. When we lobbied the governments in Europe, I recently always tried to focus more on overlooked policy topics because many easy potentials anyway have already been resolved. And I think that's also a narrative, like a topic that weaves through your presentation today. A brief example, maybe my working group, for example, found that in Austria, my country, all the state subsidized batteries for home storage. They charge at the wrong time in the day, so it's counterproductive for the energy transition. And the government, but also all NGOs, have been overlooking this topic for many years. So maybe asking you, as someone who talks to many people in the hands-on policy process, what do you think are the topics that are highly overlooked today, and where can we, as next generation of climate leaders, learn about now, because it will be super relevant in 10 years?
A very sensible question, because you see that sometimes there are decisions that look good, but in reality are wrongly applied. It's very often policies that are stop and go, subsidies that are given and then displaced, sometimes too much, so too enough. So there is which I think is the interest of looking at China development, is having a sort of long-term consistent idea of what the system should look like. The problem, what you describe, is that we don't have most of the time. We use some issues, like campaign for heat pumps, for example, like it happened in Germany, but without thinking of the system. And then you create a reaction, or you create a imbalance you are describing. So how we train you young leaders to have, it's a complex problem. It's not a simple one. There is no technological fix one. You have to look at the system and the trade-offs and the connections between the different pieces. And that's not very often. That is not, you learn in silos what you do with transport, what you do with whatever, but you don't have a systemic view, the fiscal one, the private finance one, when the whole element that will finally put in play in the transition. So I will really encourage you to have as multidisciplinary approach as you can, because then you would be equipped, well equipped in this new political setting you have to, in a way, embrace.
No more question? I know you're from industry now. He's a famous journalist, and now he works for the CTL.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for your excellent and insightful speech. I'm from CTL, but I still work as a journalist because I'm an executive director of the Net Zero Age. It's a media that's supported by CTL. And my question is very simple: is how do you think of the affection of the oil and gas crisis in Middle East? What's the affection on the global energy landscape, and will it lead to accelerate the global energy transition, or need to more dependency on the fossil fuels? What is your opinion? Thank you.
I think the normal reaction should be that it's a moment to accelerate the transition out of this fossil fuel dependence. And we have now a number of solutions. But I see with some surprise a number of countries, because they are in a way under pressure, short-term pressure, that they now say energy security is about doubling down. And that's why I think this distinction we try to elaborate more over the years of the different works, that petrostate and electrostate, even if, again, it's a simplification, have really diverging interests at that particular moment. Not in the long term, I don't think so. So I think we should be really aggressively, in a nice sense, making the case. That is not reasonable. And again, the fact that we have had 2 shocks in 5 years because of geopolitical, war in Ukraine on one side, and now aggression against Iran from US, and many other elements, you see that we cannot depend on that. So I hope that that's why I think there is a window of opportunity of EU and China to collaborate. One, because I don't think EU has any real interest in a way, fulfilling the demand of US on the LNG import. That doesn't make sense. These are very expensive, very emitting of greenhouse gases. So why, in a way, force the industry and the consumers in EU to lower the emission when we are importing such gas with all this component of methane, etc., and global warming effect? So I do think it's a moment. I know it's not easy because there are the geopolitics. China is, of course, within its own group of alliances, like the BRICS group, for example, who doesn't converge with Europe for the moment. But that, I think, is a moment to change, in a way, the way we think about things. And that this should be an opportunity to accelerate the discussion. And I am more optimistic these days.
下边来讲呢，这个图比亚娜大使要工作到今天夜里，所以我不好意思，不敢再让他再多劳累了。所以来讲呢，我想今天他的讲的这个意图讲的方向很清楚，旧的秩序会被打破，新的秩序来讲呢必然会到来，但是呢它不会自动的到来，要大家努力。所以让我们为图比亚娜大使的精彩演讲鼓掌，表示感谢。做第70期气候变化大讲堂到此结束，谢谢大家。